Barker, Director of the Mead Art Museum, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all here to our distinguished lecture by Nicholas Penny. Thank you for turning out in advance of the blizzard. I know it will be worth it, and I know the snowstorm will help us all remember this talk forever. I'm really excited. Our staff at the museum has rushed to put the finishing details to our spring exhibition, Art for All, Additions to the Collection from Antiquity to Today, and we're ready to receive you after the talk and after the questions at the Art Museum and the galleries. We hope you'll love what you see. It's my pleasure now to introduce our speaker. Dr. Nicholas Penny, Director of the National Gallery, London, is an internationally distinguished scholar, curator, and public intellectual. You'll get your money's worth today. He became director of the National Gallery in 2008 and has worked to integrate the gallery, which holds the United Kingdom's national collection of Western European paintings from 1250 to 1900, into public life. He has also led a successful campaign to purchase Titian's masterpiece, Diana and Actaeon. You've probably all followed this with eager attention in the art news as I have. Under his leadership, the National Gallery has seen a steady rise in attendance that has made it the second most visited museum in Great Britain and one of the most highly visited museums in the world. Described by London's independent newspaper as an intellectual heavyweight, and by The Guardian as defiantly highbrow, Nicholas Penny has impeccable academic credentials. Educated at St. Catherine's College, Cambridge, and at the Courtauld Institute of Art, London, he previously served as Leverhulme Research Fellow in the History of Western Art at Clare Hall, Cambridge, Slade Professor at Oxford University, Senior Research Fellow at King's College, Cambridge, and Keeper of Western Art at the Ashmolean Museum, Oxford. From 1990 until 2000, he served as the Clore Curator of Renaissance Painting at the National Gallery in Washington, in which capacity I'm saying the wrong National Gallery, in which capacity he famously identified the Madonna of the Pinks, previously assumed to be a copy, as a genuine painting by Raphael. Before returning to the National Gallery as its director, he worked as the Andrew W. Mellon Professor and Senior Curator of Sculpture and Decorative Arts at our National Gallery, the one in Washington, D.C. His numerous publications include the definitive 3-volume Catalogue of European Sculpture in the Ashmolean, the classic book, I'm sure many of you have this on your desk as I do, Taste and the Antique, The Lure of Classical Sculpture, written also with Francis Haskell, Dur to Veronese, 16th Century Painting in the National Gallery, co-authored by Jill Dunkerton and Susan Foister, and The Art of the Renaissance Bronze, written with Anthony Radcliffe. His lecture at Amherst is sponsored by the Mead, together with the Amherst College Department of Art and the History of Art, the Massachusetts Center for Interdisciplinary Renaissance Studies at UMass Amherst, and Smith College's Museums Concentration Program. His visit to the United States this weekend is made possible with generous support from Charles Wilkes, Amherst class of 1971, the chair of the Mead Art Museum's Advisory Board, and Helen Wilkes. Please join me in welcoming Nick to Amherst.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. It's very curious how we take for granted the existence of museums and public art galleries. As you know, in most European countries, these institutions, and especially the greatest of them, grew out of the private collections of princes, and the motives for their establishment were no more in need of defence or explanation than the public benefits, to which, in fact, little thought was given. But when pressure grew in the British Parliament for significant public funds to be expended on building up a collection which would form a national gallery, arguments for doing so had to be provided. And chief among these, perhaps, was an argument which would never be openly articulated. If the French had something as great as the Louvre, perhaps we should have something significant ourselves, especially after the Battle of Waterloo. But what was in fact said, and was also deeply felt, was that it would be essential for the instruction of artists and for the improvement of public taste. The trustees, soon after the foundation of the gallery, acquired old masters' paintings, which were generally acknowledged as outstanding masterpieces, such as Titian's Bacchus and Ariadne, painted for the court of Ferrara in the 1520s, and throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, greatly admired in collections in Rome. This was bought in 1826. A year earlier, Correggio's very small but exquisite Virgin and Child was purchased, the Vierge au Panier, one of the most admired of that artist's paintings. These were pictures which no one could challenge as being of enormous public value. It is actually very hard for us to trace the impact that these paintings made on British artists. In fact, I think impossible from the art that is now exhibited in collections of British art. That is not to say they didn't have an impact, but it is curious that one can't really trace it. What one can, of course, perhaps unsurprisingly, register is the significance of the landscape paintings in the National Gallery for the great school of British landscape painting in the early 19th century. The founding collection of the National Gallery included a remarkable number of paintings by Claude Lorraine, of which I'm showing you one of the most famous of all, the Embarkation of the Queen of Sheba. This painting, a masterpiece of the mid-17th century, was one which was constantly in the mind of artists in Britain, especially in the mind of J.M.W. Turner. And Turner bequeathed to the National Gallery his founding of the Carthaginian Empire, Dido building Carthage, which he had in fact exhibited before the National Gallery was founded in the year of Waterloo, 1815, when people were thinking a lot about the birth and decline of empires. This he bequeathed to the National Gallery on condition that it always hung as a pendant to the Claude. A very one-sided relationship, because Claude, of course, was never asked whether he would like her. And yes, an arrangement which we have been obliged to comply with almost ever since. It's a very, very bad idea, since we learn little from it. But some days, Turner looks unspeakably vulgar, and on other days, Claude looks hopelessly tame. To contemporaries, it showed, though, that there were living artists, or at least recently deceased artists, worthy of competition with, and not at all subordinate to, the old masters. It even showed how an established compositional formula could be reworked, how aerial perspective could actually begin to consume the solidity of the material world. You'll see this especially on the horizon, but also on the far right up portion of the painting, that massive build-up of cliffs and buildings, which Claude would never have attempted. Where the solid world seems to dissolve, this was a new development in painting, a competition, if you like, between aerial and linear perspective. The dialogue between ancient examples and contemporary innovation was, in fact, as is often forgotten, even by the gallery's staff today, it was actually built into the National Gallery when the new building was completed in 1838, a building that you see today across the north side of Trafalgar Square. Because this building was in fact shared by the National Gallery with the Royal Academy, the whole right-hand side of the building, as you look at it, being occupied by the Royal Academy, and a place where you visited the contemporary art in an annual exhibition. Incidentally, it seems odd to many people that steps don't flow down from the portico. There really wasn't space for that. But you approach the gallery even today by steps on the sides of the portico. And that did make more sense when there were essentially two entrances to two institutions. It's curious to reflect that the earliest 15th century paintings, which were acquired for the National Collection, only arrived in the 1840s, Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait of 1434, was purchased in 1842 and put on exhibition in 1843. And a gift, rather than a purchase, the two side panels, I'm only showing one of them, painted at the end of the first decade of the 15th century in Florence by Lorenzo Monaco. And those arrived in 1848. Neither were acquired as exemplary masterpieces with the idea that they would be imitated by contemporary artists or considered as models of perfect taste. They were rather considered as marginal curiosities, exquisite, even dazzling in the case of the Van Eyck, but not a painting which was expected to make an impression on young British art students working in the Royal Academy next door. The eye-aching realism of and the intense scrutiny of surfaces, the tense compositional space of the Van Eyck, together, so surprisingly, together with a pale, brilliant palette and the light, floating silhouettes of figures in the Lorenzo Monaco, in fact, combined together with immediate and astonishing effect in the minds of young art students at the Royal Academy. And in 1849, visitors to the Royal Academy's exhibition were startled to see Lorenzo and Isabella, a Quattrocento subject incidentally, painted in a pre-Raphaelite technique by the young John Everett Millais. This is not, in fact, going to be a lecture about European painting. I didn't know, by the way, about what it was going to be a lecture about when I merely knew the theme that I wanted to treat when I devised the title for Amherst last year. But I do want to propose that radical developments of art were frequently made possible by the enthusiasm of collectors and curators. A very interesting case in painting comes at the very end of the 19th century, at the very beginning of the 20th, with Picasso. His Blind Guitarist of 1903 has always been recognised as a sort of homage in its odd elongations and dislocations to the work of El Greco. It owes much to El Greco's physical types and to his lighting effects, although not to his colour schemes. And El Greco is regularly described by art historians as a neglected and even rejected figure, whilst invented or rediscovered by avant-garde painters. But this was not at all the case. The National Gallery, for example, acquired its St. Jerome, which you see on the screen here, at the Hamilton Palace sale in 1882. And the great picture there of Christ expelling the traders from the temple was presented to the National Gallery by J.C. Robinson, an elderly major figure in the London art world, previously keeper of the Queen's pictures, in 1896. And in fact, later on, when El Greco becomes a great cult figure with defenders of avant-garde painting, the National Gallery acquired, at the urgent behest of leading critics of the time, it's only El Greco that isn't actually by El Greco. So the process of cause and can, of course, work both ways. I'm glad that you have agreed to come to this lecture. I'm glad also that I didn't, in fact, insert into the title the truth about this lecture, which is that, in fact, it is henceforth going to concern itself almost entirely with sculpture, because I find that my audiences are smaller for that. But I was very eager to make this a lecture appropriate for Amherst. And I was delighted to discover illustrations in the splendid guide to masterpieces, which has, I think, only recently been published, and which Sandy Wilkes kindly sent me, and to which, in the introductory essay by Lizzie Barker, I was absolutely delighted to see this wonderful photograph of the kind of the Mead's vanished or dispersed parent or grandparent on the third floor of Williston Hall. This assembly does not survive, but I'm rather astonished and delighted to discover that almost all these plaster casts, even if dispersed, do survive. It is indeed the case that most collections of plaster casts assembled in this period, in the second half of the 19th century, have been either destroyed or dispersed. And in fact, more of them survive in this part of North America than any other part of the English-speaking world. But they were famous all over Europe. The Neue Museum in Berlin, which has recently been restored and reopened, is now a museum largely of Egyptian art. But when it was originally created, it was principally as one of the largest collections of plaster casts of ancient sculpture in the world, connected by a bridge with the Alfred Museum, which the older foundation in Berlin, which contained the original works in marble and bronze. I think very few people who go to this museum today to admire, whether to admire Chipperfield's architecture or to admire Stuller's original architecture, or, of course, to pay homage to the Egyptian art, realise this. The Fine Arts Museum in Budapest, a portion of this gigantic institution on the screen at the moment, was filled with casts of sculpture and architecture, and then had original paintings only on the upper floor. Very few great European museums retain any significant collections of this sort. The cast collection at the Victorian Albert Museum in London and parts of the Pushkin Museum in Moscow are the great exceptions. I don't think many people also realise that the chief attraction of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and indeed of the Metropolitan Museum in New York in the last decades of the 19th century, was the plaster collections that they had formed. These cast collections met the criteria which had determined the creation of the National Gallery in London. These were all considerable masterpieces which could be studied by art students. Academies of art had long contained collections of this kind. But they were also collections which could improve the taste and establish the standards in the general public. And of course, in a university museum, in the minds of the young elite. And the great thing about them was that no one had could ever have privileged access to all these great works of art together. Something, of course, was lost, but the gain was gigantic. The story of how this taste changed, how everyone managed to forget that these museums had once been so dedicated to plaster cast, is a story which deserves to be told in full. It's only been told in very small, fragmentary histories of separate institutions. A third determinant for the establishment of these collections, even if only as some sort of supplement to the teaching of classics and of some sort of art historical study, the growth of art history indeed must have been a stimulant to these enormous collections. Well over 25 years ago now, I published with Francis Haskell Taste and the Antique, which was intended as a guide to the canon that was gradually formed in this way by these cast collections, and photographs of the kind that I've been showing you, I'm showing you again now, were taken by us as evidence, just the evidence that interested most, which told one about what really were familiar works in those period. In the period only a century before we were writing this book, which had been in so many cases lost. So you can see here, if you try really hard, the wrestlers from the Uffizi, the dying gladiator from the Capitoline Museum, the fighting gladiator, that you can't miss, and then in the Louvre, right in the middle. Not everything is in fact at all easy to make out. At the extreme end of the room, in this case, you can see, in this slide, you can see what is in fact the nymph à la coquille, the nymph with a shell in the Louvre, which for a long time had been in the Borghese collection. It's one of the statues which Napoleon bought from his bankrupt brother-in-law, Prince Borghese. It had been, for well over a century, a celebrated model for sculptors when Napoleon acquired it for the Louvre, including the great French sculptor, François Girardon, whose copy, with elegant variations, is on the right of the screen. This was a copy made for, I think, for Versailles. This nymph was no less appealing in the 1880s, when we see her as a plaster cast here at Amherst. And indeed, 1886 is the date of this very beautiful statue of Spring, a maiden gathering flowers, made first for the garden of the Duc d'Aumale at Chantilly, and also known in this exquisite statuette. And as you can see from the arrangement of the images here, the motif of one breast seen through the drapery and the other exposed and underlined by drapery falling below it is taken in reverse from the antique model. And it isn't merely a motif, but a form of technical virtuosity in carving, exquisite low relief on the one hand, and deep and difficult undercutting on the other. Every aspect of this sculpture by Chapoux can probably be analysed and discussed in this way. And there are many aspects to consider. But in no sense is it a slavish imitation of the antique, or indeed constrained by ancient examples. Indeed, I know of no ancient marble sculpture of a crouching figure, and it may well have been, in fact, inspired as much by some of the mural paintings found in the ancient cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Lurking on the left of the hall at Amherst is a cast of an ancient bronze, one of very few antiquities reproduced here by plaster, which were known in the Middle Ages. This is a figure of the Spinario. You can see the crouching boy just in front of a small model of the Poxymenos, and in front also of the imposing Caryatid, to which we will return. This was one of the first ancient sculptures to be extensively copied on a small scale. Here's the original, which is now in the Capitoline Museum. But it was copied extensively in the material in which it was originally made, that's to say in bronze. Here's a very late example, which is in this collection here at the Mead, not on display at the moment, which would have been acquired in Naples, great place for collecting very, very high quality bronze reproductions after the antique, at the very end of the 19th century, perhaps a little after the formation of the plaster cast collection. And here, beside the original, are two reduced early copies, one by Antico and the other, in reverse pose, by Riccio, both made in the early years of the 16th century, and the latter adapted as probably an inkstand or some sort of desk furniture. Full-size copies are rarer, but there is one in the Metropolitan Museum attributed to Gaggini and dated to 1500, I think wrongly, which is of very great beauty, but is also original in several interesting respects. The pose is made, the seat is made more comfortable, and more than that, the forms, I think, are more softly rounded. But the most obvious change is in the hair, which I will show you a detail on one side. This sculptor realized that there was something absurd about the hair of the original. And that is that unless treated in the way that waxed and the like, that you're sometimes proposed to you by barbers, the hair would of course fall forward rather than down straight over the ears in the way that it does. And this shows you, I think, how the extraordinary mystique with which certain standard and highly established canonical sculptures can have, that no one actually challenged this until, in fact, about the 1880s, the date of our photographs. Because at that date, other versions in marble of the Spinario began to appear. And this one in the British Museum had, of course, a completely different type of head. He looked more like an urchin, and he had shorter hair, which is not falling in that slightly archaic way over the ears. The bronze in the Capitoline Museum, then, was itself a copy, and indeed not only a copy, but a pastiche, with a head from another ancient statue, one which was standing up, not seated, and bending forward. A style altogether in the head, and that highly naturalistic look given to the body of this really genre figure. So, although the idea of a canon implies permanence, we discover that scholarship was at this very moment making major revisions to the status of some of the works of art held up as perfect models. An interesting aspect of the Amherst collection, which is very important in this respect, and which will not have escaped your notice, is that it was not entirely dedicated to antiquities. At least one major 19th century figure was included, that is the Hebe of Canova. You'll see the sprightly dancing figure on the right of the screen. And in addition, you can see that there were a great many works by or extracted from the sculpture of Michelangelo. You can see his Moses, and nearby the head of his David, and near that a slave, and in front of those figures, and in front also, it seems, of Canova's Hebe, what I think is the head of the Virgin in the Pietà. Elsewhere, there was a newly discovered work by Michelangelo, a statue supposed to represent Cupid, which the Victorian Albert Museum had acquired in 1860. I can't see this in the photographs, but I do remember encountering it in one of the corridors here at Amherst when I last visited 6 or 7 years ago, and I'm very glad to say that it does still exist, and I was able to find a photograph of it, which is included here beside the original, if you can call it an original, in the Victorian Albert Museum. Although the scholarly world was still spellbound by this piece, this masterpiece by Michelangelo, in the 1880s, it was increasingly doubted and gradually fell from favour and was eventually attributed by Sir John Pope Hennessy to the minor Florentine 16th century sculptor Valerio Cioli. And it too is in fact a sort of pasticcio, because part of it is an ancient Roman torso, is greatly reworked and then restored by Cioli as a Narcissus or perhaps a fisher boy. And now you'll have difficulty finding it in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Also in the 1880s, sculptors were beginning to have an increased awareness of the distinction between original Greek sculpture of the 5th century and earlier, and all the later work which copied it or was derived from it. To judge from the arrangement recorded in the photographs we've been studying, chronology was of limited interest in the display of ancient statues, on casts after ancient statues, here in Amherst. It is significant, for example, that the caryatid, which occupies such a prominent place in the gallery, is in fact a cast of a Greco-Roman marble dated now to between 140 and 170 AD, 140 and 170 of the Christian era, which was discovered in the late 16th century near the Via Appia, outside Rome, and was acquired by Charles Townley in 1784, an English collector, who then bequeathed it to the British Museum. And you can see it in the British Museum today. It's now actually been given a remarkably prominent place on the staircase of the British Museum. It used to be rather hard to find. But that's not because it is very highly esteemed today. It is a far less important caryatid than the one which was removed from the Erechtheum in Athens under Lord Elgin and given to the British Museum, acquired by the British Museum in 1816. Now, portions of the so-called Parthenon marbles, or the Elgin marbles, were included, of course, in this great display. And you can see some of the frieze that originally ran around this room in the entrance to this very building. But I don't think this cast collection included any of the larger figures from the Parthenon. This dates from 5th century, and of course it would have been known to Professor Mather. And the Elgin marbles, of course, would certainly have been available for study in their complete form, together with the Erechtheum caryatid in photographs. And it was represented in other cast collections, I know, in North America. When the caryatid you're looking at now was carved in ancient Athens, it represented a completely new departure in sculpture. Nothing quite like it had been seen before, especially in the treatment of the drapery. In parts, this drapery, of course, reveals the body beneath. But where it falls in heavy folds, and also where it is gathered, it has a plasticity which suggests the use of clay models. And is only possible because of the very extensive and skillful use of drills to undercut the marble effectively. Only a few years before the photograph of which we've been studying of the collections at Amherst, Augustus St. Gaudens carved the great fireplace in red limestone. Worth dwelling on a little. For the Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue, built for Cornelius Vanderbilt II. This was completed between 1881 and 1883 and is now in the American Court of the Metropolitan Museum. The two figures represent love and peace. Actually, they declare as much. They've got, in case you didn't know the difference between the two of them. I'm showing you amor, that's love, on the left. It is a modern version of caryatid. And the way that the hands, as well as her head, a bowed, are used for carrying the weight, enables her head to be pressed lowered and give her a more pensive, if you like, romantic character, which would have been unlikely in antiquity, and enables the sculptor to have perhaps a little bit more of the spirit of Michelangelo than one might have expected in a caryatid figure. I'm not suggesting that St. Gordon's was directly influenced, in fact, by the Erechtheian maiden, as his caryatid is sometimes known. But I'm quite sure that this style of Athenian drapery carving of the 5th century, and in particular the swirling vitality of the drapery, falling over and curling up over limbs and breasts, and falling softly like waves cresting against, running over, slipping over, swirling beneath boulders. This was absolutely his ideal in sculpture. The Vanderbilt maiden doesn't just support projecting entablature over the mantle, but a label identifying her as Amor. St. Gordon's takes this up repeatedly and almost obsessively in subsequent sculpture of his. I don't think these get better and better as works of sculpture. The challenge, although they are enormously admired, the challenge faced by St. Gordon's in his Vanderbilt chimneypiece was taken up later by Daniel Chester French in the monument to the great architect Richard Morris Hunt of 1896 to 1901, which you'll see by the side of Central Park. It serves as something between a park bench and a temple. And I think one of the most interesting architectural monuments, incidentally, in granite created in that period. Here, in the female figure, I'm referring to the sculpture, of course, are not supporters, but they are, nevertheless, of deliberately architectural character, befitting their abstract identity as allegories of painting and sculpture on the one hand, and architecture on the other. Architecture, which is carrying a little model of Hunt's most famous building, is nearer to us here. They are as architectural as the Ionic columns incorporated in this beautiful structure, which incidentally is a work of an architect totally unknown to me, called Bruce Price, but apparently following St. Gordon's own, Daniel Chester French's own ideas. And here is painting and sculpture. She's got a mallet in one hand, a palette in the other, and a little sculptural model resting on the palette, oddly. And you can see how the severe lines of the drapery enhance this architectural character, and also how the curvature of the gown as it meets the plinth matches the very beautiful and unusual treatment of the pier behind her, which also swells in just this way. Nevertheless, the actual drapery has a complex, soft, and lively quality that we have been looking at, and it is clearly a figure which originates in a clay model. It's clearly plastic in its origins. And of course, French had casts made of the maquettes for these figures, one of which is in the Mead here, and these two quite obviously have a waxy or a clayish character. So even when sculpture gets highly architectural at this date, it still retains this remarkable and beautiful plasticity, not only in the flesh, but in the drapery forms. Although I have emphasized the influence of antiquity on these American sculptures, I think it is also important to emphasize that women especially ladies whose affluence enabled them to wear the loose and aesthetic gowns of this date, emancipated from the corset, also adopted a similar style of dress, and that would of course have made these figures less alien than they may seem to us. How closely we can in fact feel to ancient Greek figures and sculptures is something which is difficult for us to be quite sure of today, how difficult it was or easy it was for people in previous centuries. But when thinking of the ordinary people of Mediterranean countries, it was quite commonly thought that they had some natural affinity with or were directly descended from those figures depicted on ancient works of art, such as on the Etruscan vessel contemplated by, or in any case, mysteriously surviving beside this girl painted by Vedder, which is also in the Mead. But of course, when people began more seriously to collect these ancient vases, whether described as Etruscan or, of course, Greek, which they usually were, even when found in Italy, the style becomes quite distinctly archaic. And here, of course, is one of the most beautiful objects in the Mead, dated to 550s, 525 BC, this beautiful amphora. But the style of these figures is clearly archaic, clearly in many ways very alien to in style, but also in manner and in their activities to anything likely to have occurred at this time. And that may have been to the time in which they were collected, which is in the 20th century in this case. So they have a kind of fascination which depends on them belonging to a different era. And that is, I suppose, one of the things that we really mean by the archaic. This is only one fine example of genuine Greek art which had begun to replace the plaster casts in the college museums in New England. Another would be the remarkable, but quite crude actually, grave steeling in the Mead, which you see on the left-hand screen here. And Amherst is not the only college collecting antique art. This plaster cast on the right of quite an early Greek grave relief is from Mount Holyoke. And in the following year to its acquisition, in 1903, this fragmentary and quite astonishing relief arrived in that collection as well. This sculpture is in earlier, these sculptures are an earlier style, the ones I've just mentioned, to any that we have looked at so far. Earlier in style to the great Erechtheum Caryatid. In style is perhaps best exemplified by the girl with a dove, one of the most beautiful ancient sculptures in the Metropolitan Museum, which was acquired from Brocklesby Park in Lincolnshire in 1927. Because this figure, which is in the same sort of style as those we were looking at, is quite distinctly a glyptic style of carving. That's to say, it's a type of carving which doesn't depend on any models made in a soft material of clay or wax. It began life as a carving, as something chiselled, or at least as something drawn and chiselled. At this moment, shortly after museums became excited by the discovery of the archaic and of the glyptic in Greek sculpture, there emerged the third great American artist to achieve international acclaim, Paul Manship. Manship was born in 1885 in Minnesota, arrived in New York in 1905, and went on to study in Philadelphia in 1907. And between 1909 and 1912, he was a fellow at the newly founded American Academy in Rome. The exhibition of his work in New York on his return in 1913 excited huge interest Dryad, a version of which it was cast in an edition, was acquired by Smith College only 2 years later. Clearly, as you can see from the subject, was likely to be fairly controversial, but in fact, subjects of this kind, beasts or half-beasts, assaulting nymphs, were quite standard for sculpture. But the treatment here is quite remarkable. The group, although in the round, is conceived as a sort of high relief, and the emphasis on silhouette is, of course, influenced by Greek vase painting, and something which is still clearer in the low relief that you can see on the pedestal. When we look at the drapery style, we find the most complete renunciation of the plasticity of St. Gordon's, and of course of the new styles, the latest style of sculpture in Paris, the style of Rodin. Bronze is used here not as a way to reproduce forms modelled in soft clay or wax, but to enhance the sharp edges, the crisp geometry of relief, a geometry which originates in the patterns found in archaic Greek and also, in fact, in Egyptian sculpture. Fluting, the repeated hollows with sharp salients, is, of course, a feature of Greek marble architecture, which, like Greek marble sculpture, was developed from work in wood, work which has not survived. The hollow being the mark of a gouge or wood chisel used precisely. The reappreciation of carved patterns in sculpture at this date was not only associated with archaic Greek work, but also with Romanesque sculpture. And here is a wooden Romanesque Virgin and Child, and even with Byzantine art, which was being imitated by some sculptors as early as 1913. This is an example in Venice by a sculptor called Rupolo, dated 1913. Look at those zigzags down the side of the figure, and you'll see something similar on this, in one of the many superimposed fan-like forms of fluting and pleating in Manship's extraordinary drapery. What had Manship studied? By what was he chiefly inspired? The most remarkable piece of archaic sculpture acquired by the Metropolitan Museum in this period may have been the Sphinx Stele, which I'm showing you here, but it arrived in New York in 1911, so at a moment when Manship was in Rome. The Sphinx, which crowns it, is a very much bolder in character than the one which you may remember seeing in the collection of plaster casts at Amherst. Not long after his return, they are dated to 1917, Manship executed this pair of sphinxes, of griffins rather, which now adorn the sculpture garden of Brook Green in South Carolina. They are astonishing inventions, which, like his marvellous vase of a little earlier, show that he knew about the metal attachments of archaic Greek vessels. For example, the bronze cauldron attachment on the right here from the 3rd quarter of the 7th century BC, which was acquired by the Metropolitan in 1972. And many other examples, however, were available for him to study. To remind you of the marble version. On the vase, you can see a very ecstatic dancing girl in relief. This relates closely to one of Manship's most remarkable freestanding sculptures, his Salome of 1915, here shown in differently patinated bronze versions. Where does this invention come from? In part, perhaps, from Greek vases, where very active and often dancing figures have the face turned in profile away from the direction in which the figure moves, so the knees pointing one way and the nose pointing the other, as indeed you see in this beautiful vessel on the right, which is in Mount Holyoke. and about 500 BC. Manship was not, in fact, the only artist at this date to be really excited by the geometric action and indeed the erotic force of archaic Greek art. The best parallel for his work may be by the painter, also the costume and stage designer, Leon Bakst, from Russia. Bakst had visited Greece, which indeed Manship did, and you can see in this drapery study on the left how he was trying to imagine the colours as well as the actual textiles which would have been represented in archaic Greek work. And here on the right, you see the astonishing costume which he designed for Ida Rubinstein in 1909 for her performance as Cleopatra. It's extremely outrageously revealing in its upper part of her body. And also, more remarkably still in a way, is he seems to have ornamented the drapery, if you can call it drapery, with black beads to accentuate the pubic area. I don't think this has quite the same parallel in Manship's work, but I do find that it is fairly extraordinary what Manship was depicting at this state and how everyone seems to have accepted it. Something other than Greek art has entered perhaps into Bakst's creation, but also into Manship's, and that is some sort of knowledge of Indian sculpture, which is clear, I think, from the almost endless number of necklaces, belts, and body jewellery generally worn by or somehow decorating this particular figure. And I'm demonstrating this by putting his sculpture next to this is very, very lively 12th century dancing celestial from Uttar Pradesh, which is a promised gift to the Metropolitan Museum. But one, if one were to continue to research this subject, one should really look at those books on Indian sculpture, which appeared in the very early 20th century. At the moment, this is the first moment when, because of museum interest, people were beginning to take really seriously this particular form of sculpture. And Manship has responded to it immediately. Manship's sources have provided work for numerous doctoral students. But I believe that it was the Archaeological Museum in Naples that provided him with most of his ideas. At first, this may seem surprising because the sculpture displayed there is Roman, from the buried cities of Herculaneum and Pompeii. And it is a striking fact that a great deal of the sculpture found there was copied or adapted from not just Greek work, but archaic Greek work. When we look at Manship's larger bronzes, such as his Diana and Actium group, again at Brook Green, which was originally gilded, you can still see some patches of gilding around the breast in this photograph, and with enamelled eyes, which have survived, as you can see, remarkably well. It is the Herculaneum dancers that come most strongly to mind. And not only because of the technique, but also because of the style of extremely simplified drapery folds. The Mead has an example of Manship's most successful exercise in this heroic mode. His Antelope and Hunter, or Hunter and Antelope, of 1914. The gazelle is a most effective part of this group, considered merely as a silhouette of arrested action. It is quite an extraordinary invention. He picks it up again in the more dainty and lyrical work, perhaps his most famous work, The Dancer with Gazelles of 1916, where he incorporates into sculpture all the grace and elegance of the best type of Greek vase painting work. Manship hoped to be remembered by work which was more heroic and monumental. Also, he wanted to escape from the museum. But these gazelles are merely animated versions of one of the most admired and most beautiful sculptures in the museum, in the National Museum in Naples. 11th century Nepal was far away, one feels, from anything that could be found in the 20th century. And if he escaped from the museum, it was rarely only into the academic life class, rather than into the modern world. By the 1920s, Manship remained a successful sculptor, but one no longer considered as an innovator, and his critical reputation was in gradual decline. I think that he had simply lost his way. The influence of his work was very strong and maybe felt in some very great sculptures by other artists, in this beautiful dancing figure with Greek head and Asiatic attitude, which was, and with marvellous pleating of the skirt, carved out of a single block of limestone, the same block as a pedestal that supports her, a sculpture by Nadelman of 1916 to 18. And his influence remains decisive on the beautiful nude Iseult of 1926 by Edward McCartan, now in the National Gallery of Art in Washington. I say this not merely on account of the gazelle, which derives, of course, not only from Manship, but from Greek vases, but I would make the claim on account of the fascinating negative spaces between the arms, below the arms, and between the legs. And also on account of the somewhat mysterious gestures, air of enchantment, which surely reflect, even if only distantly, some knowledge of Asiatic goddesses. It is easy to claim that Manship's problem was that he was a museum artist who didn't really manage to come to terms with the modern world. And that you may feel to be true of both these last two sculptures that we've looked at. But perhaps it's truer to claim that Manship was in the wrong part of the museum, or in the wrong museum. Already by 1911, Picasso was taking inspiration from art which was not merely archaic, but primitive, or indeed, in imperialist terms, savage. Sculptors, like the young Henry Moore, would soon create a modernist sculpture out of earlier work than that which Manship had studied, out of Cycladic figures dating from 2500 BC, or with reference to the massive forms of Egyptian granite carvings, both to be found in the British Museum. The very modern, whether carved by Moore or by Barbara Hepworth, whose work you see on the right here, or devised in metal or in another medium by Archipenko, was also prehistoric, of universal significance because abstracted from known historical circumstances. But this sort of modernism was deeply dependent on the contents of museums, even if not on those of art museums. And the story of modern sculpture is in fact also a story of museum influence. But that is for another day. Thank you very much.